Welcome to the joint hearing of the House Committee on Ways and Means and the House Select Study Committee on Sustainable Property Tax Relief. Thank you all for being here today. First, I want to thank the members of both committees for their commitment to Texas. Members, as you'll hear today, Texas's strong economy and stable fiscal position enable us to build on last session's historic property tax relief and further reduce school district property taxes next session. I look forward to working with each of you to do so. I also thank once again the Ways and Means Committee for their incredibly hard work during the last session. That hard work led to the largest property tax cut in history, with $18 billion in total property tax cuts, a 23% reduction in school district Tier 1 M&O rates, a 150% increase in the homestead exemption, a new 20% appraisal increase limit to protect small businesses, and increased appraisal district oversight with 3 new elected board members. This historic tax relief accomplishment could not have happened without the vision and commitment to providing meaningful tax relief of this committee and the entire Texas House. I know that each of you will bring the same vision and commitment to the 89th session to provide even more property tax relief for all Texans. Lastly, I want to thank Speaker Phelan, first for his strong commitment to further property tax relief, second for his creation of the Select Committee to thoughtfully analyze these critical issues, and finally, for his ongoing leadership that ensures the Texas House will do even more to reduce property taxes next session. Members, does anyone have any comments before we begin? All right, seeing none. The committee will now consider all of the following charges: monitor the agencies and programs under the committee's jurisdiction and oversee the implementation of HJR2 and SB2. Conduct active oversight of all associated rulemaking and other governmental actions taken to ensure the intended legislative outcome of HJR2 and SB2. Study and make recommendations to build on the historic property tax relief provided by the 88th legislature, including whether Texas's economic performance and state tax revenues support further compression of school district tax rates, whether to extend the limitation on appraised value of certain non-homestead real property past the current expiration date of December 31st, 2026, whether to maintain the homestead exemption at its current rate, and whether to further reduce the limit on appraised value of homesteads. Chair calls Comptroller Glenn Hager.
Mr. Chairman, members, Glenn Hager, Texas Controller of Public Accounts. I'm going to give you just a few prepared remarks. We also handed out this as well that gives a comparison of a couple of different charts. Some of the testimonial reference some of these numbers, but I'm not going to necessarily point to them. So I'll do the prepared remarks and then happy to answer any questions that any of you may have. So on July 17th, I shared with the legislature my certification revenue estimate, no revision letter, and cited the fact that total revenue, tax revenue, and net general revenue related GRR collections through the first 10 months of fiscal 2024 were tracking in line with our 24-25 CRE. We just closed fiscal year 24 at the end of August, and I can report that our general related revenue collections were a modest 1.5% above our CRE. As expected, tax revenue collections reflect the decline in general price inflation and a slowing in the rate of growth in economic activity, as well as lower natural gas prices. On the other hand, we had higher than expected interest income due to higher interest rates for longer than was anticipated when we released the certification revenue estimate. Sales tax revenue, which accounts for 58% of all tax collections, was 1.2% above collections in fiscal year 2023, with overall tax collections were essentially flat as consumer spending had cooled. In other taxes, as compared to fiscal year 23, motor vehicle sales and rental tax revenues was up 0.2%, franchise tax was up 0.6%, oil production tax was up 6%, while natural gas production tax was down 36%. The Economic Stabilization Fund and the State Highway Fund both received funding from oil and natural gas severance taxes collections, and in November of this year, my office will deposit $2.7 billion in each of those funds, which is down from $3 billion that we deposited in each of those funds a year ago. Texas will have close to $24 billion in our Economic Stabilization Fund after the oil and gas transfers of these taxes, as well as accounting for interest and investment income and any outstanding appropriations. As to a few numbers on the current state of the Texas economy, total non-agriculture employment in Texas was a little over 14 million in August, which was up 2.2% from the same time a year ago. Texas was ranked as the 7th fastest growing state for employment among all states and had the fastest growth among the 10 most populous states in the nation. Our unemployment rate in Texas was 4.1% as compared to 4.2% in the United States. Growth of the Texas economy in real and nominal terms in 2024 was moderately higher than the average that we've had in the last 25 years, and we project for fiscal year 2025 that our economic growth will be a rate moderately lower. While we project moderated growth this fiscal year, there are no signs of an imminent recession, nor are there signs of an accelerated economic expansion that would necessitate a revision to our current economic forecast. Again, we expect growth at a more modest pace in this year. The CRE forecasted 2024-25 ending balance at $18 billion, which has been adjusted based on a subsequent appropriation by you, the legislature, in the fourth called special session, and an adjustment for the contingent appropriation for public education and education savings accounts that did not get enacted. Also assuming a need for a supplemental appropriation for fiscal year 24-25, I would expect that the 24-25 ending balance will be closer to $20 billion. We are starting our work on the upcoming biennial revenue estimate for next session. Without knowing that estimate at this time, I would note that any significant expenditures, such as further investments in, say, for example, electric grid reliability, public education funding, or any other items, could obviously significantly reduce the estimated balance. So that was a lot. So let me tell you in short. 1, Texas is in a strong position right now. Number 2, we expect modest growth in the upcoming future. And 3, while we have strong cash balances overall, it only takes 2 or 3 major policy decisions to substantially reduce or eliminate that balance. In closing, I will continue to monitor the Texas economy. We will keep you informed of any events that arise. And as always, we're going to highlight that any significant change and uncertainties in the global economy can deviate from these expectations. However, with that, as I said, we continue to monitor, and when we see something different, we're going to let you know. So with that, I will stop. Questions, comments, what do you have for me? If any. And if you don't, it has been great to see all of you.
Well, thank you for being here, and I believe Representative Gervin Hawkins has...
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good to see you.
Good afternoon. No, I'm sorry. Good to see you. I just want to be clear.
Yes,
so
ma'am.
I want to fully understand.
Yes, ma'am.
So CRE stands for Certified Revenue Estimate.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. When we talk about the ESA funds or
Yes, ma'am.
that's separate from surplus.
So when you said the Economic Stabilization Fund,
Yes.
ma'am. So part of our oil and gas severance tax collections, 37.5% goes into our Economic Stabilization Fund, and also an equal amount goes into transportation funding. And so therefore a percentage of it stays in the general revenue in the Treasury for y'all to expend. Part of it goes into that savings account that was created in the late 1980s when we had that oil bust. When I got in this role, that Economic Stabilization Fund or the state savings account had a little over $6 billion. However, today, as I mentioned, when we finish transferring those funds, we settle up the end of the year, at the end of August, whatever the oil and gas severance tax collections and the percentage that's supposed to go to the state savings account, we'll transfer that in November, and we typically transfer that same time in Department of Transportation State Highway Fund. And so therefore, last year we transferred into both of them, $3 billion. This year, because natural gas prices were lower than they were the year before, it's only $2.7 billion. But just to make a point, in some of the first few years I was in this role, at one point we had only transferred $794 million into both funds in a total year. So the point is, we still have pretty healthy oil and gas severance tax collections coming into the state treasury, and part of that goes into the fund. Y'all have enabled my office over the last several years to invest those funds in a manner to try to maintain the purchasing power. And so in part, our investment incomes as well now means that fund in a couple months will have about $24 billion, which is pretty substantial.
If I was to look at a state of Texas balance sheet,
Yes, ma'am.
what would our current assets be?
So if you look at our current assets, at least in liquidity, we're going to end up having obviously the Economic Stabilization Fund, and then our overall cash balance. If you look at, I would assume right now we probably in the general treasury and all funds. I mean, some years we used to have only $30 billion, but in the last few years we've had substantial revenues come in. Inflation was higher, and also all the federal dollars that were coming. That y'all have expended a lot of those. But I don't recall the exact treasury number, but it's in the tens of billions of dollars.
Tens of billions. And if I looked at our fund balance, what would that look like?
So it depends, obviously, by month to month. For example, right now, it will be lower in the month of November and December than other months, in part because in the first 3 months of a fiscal year, September, October, and November, are typically more money is going out than coming in, because Texas made the decision over 4 decades ago that we would front load the school districts.
Okay.
50% of the school finance funds in September, October, and November. So therefore, the point was they don't have their property taxes coming in. The state would front load because they have tremendous expenditures, instead of requiring them to potentially go out and borrow money to match for that shortage. Texas would. So my point is, our cash fund balance is going to be lower in the upcoming months in the general treasury than we would in other times of the year, because we're front loading.
All right, so I want to understand, so as I'm explaining to my constituents, so when we enacted the bill to do tax savings, the
Yes, ma'am.
homestead exemption, is it simply, and I guess counties would be different. Let's say in Bexar County, it was a $25,000 homestead exemption. Then we go up to a $100,000 homestead exemption. How does that directly impact tax receipts for both districts and or for the cities?
So I think the short and simplicity of it is, you have 2 buckets of money that fund, for example, public education. You have that which comes out of our pockets as local property taxpayers, and then you have that comes out of our pockets in some other fashion as state taxpayers. As state taxpayers, 58% of all of it is sales tax. So that's the principal amount of that we pay in taxes in the state, even though there's a wide range of different taxes that goes into that bucket. And so, however, of these 2 buckets, local money and state money, that funds public education. And so as y'all buy down property tax rates, or you give a higher exemption for, say, for example, on a homestead, then essentially the state, we as state taxpayers, are putting a larger amount into the bucket overall to fund public education. So it's a shifting from one pocket to another, and a different number of type of taxpayers. That's the simplicity of it.
And how is that impacting the cities itself?
Well, if
or the local municipalities in general?
I would let them answer that question themselves rather than me answering that question, because I don't necessarily look at details of 1,500 plus cities and 254 counties of their finances every single year.
Understood.
Yeah.
Not knowing those exact numbers, but logic would say that if my exemptions are higher, okay, that means I'm getting less revenue in.
Assuming that property values do not increase and or other values are being improved in those communities.
But we're looking at the revenue coming in, because there's caps on how much, even though the values may increase, there's caps on how much you can collect. So if my cap is a 10% annually, but yet I've increased the exemptions by 300%, then I'm bringing in less revenue. I'm just talking about simple accounting logic.
I think, again, it just depends on what are the value increases, because what are the offsets to all the different numbers. And without seeing each one, I mean, I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's just the point being is, it's going to be 254 scenarios for the counties and 1,500 for cities.
Understand, Comptroller, but I'm talking accounting. You're a CPA, I'm assuming, right? Okay.
I hire a lot of them.
I have an undergrad degree in accounting. Let's talk logic here, okay? What I'm saying is, if I have a cap on the revenue and my exemptions have increased, you don't have to know 54 and what all I'm doing is differently, but logically, I'm bringing less into that local taxing entity.
If there were no other variables, but there are other variables.
Understood.
That's all my point. So
right.
if there were 0 other variables,
yes,
then I could understand where you're going. But
and is that a fact? If there were 0 other variables,
but I think there are other variables that come in. There are other variables.
And those variables could
be what is the tax rate, what is the valuation in the community,
new things coming online, all of
yes,
those
ma'am.
Stuff.
All those change every year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there algorithms that any county or any municipality can use to kind of look at how they're impacted?
I would have to let them answer that. I don't know the answer to that offhand.
Okay. All right.
We'll try to look at the broad scale, but not in depth.
Understood. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Chair recognizes Ms. Johnson for some questions. Just kidding. Chair recognizes Representative Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here.
Good to see you. Yes, ma'am.
You too. I wanted to talk for a minute about your cash on hand, cash balance, because I, like many of my colleagues, use the term surplus, and people in the public generally expect that to mean we have $20 billion just sitting there that we could spend.
Estimated, potentially. Right.
But that $20 billion includes some things that aren't necessarily available to us. My understanding from talking to your office is that about $8.5 billion of that is dedicated funds that we have not appropriated for their intended purpose, right?
I don't have that in front of me, but probably
that's money that's there.
There will probably be a percent that are dedicated. There's probably a percent that's not dedicated. There's a percent that could be balances of dedicated accounts.
Right.
That, we have that, you've been around, I've been around, we've had that discussion many times, as in the policy of the legislature.
Right, and we made efforts several sessions back under Drew Darby to reduce the use of dedicated funds to balance the budget, certify the budget. And we're finding that we still have an issue there in terms of we're collecting this money, taxes, fees, whatever from Texans, for a specific purpose, and then not spending it on that purpose.
Not appropriate all of it.
Not appropriating
it. That's correct.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm hoping we're going to look at that again this next session.
Understand.
But my point right now is to just try to get a handle on what we're really talking about with our cash reserves. That is a cash reserve, but it's not available for spending on other things.
Well, correct. However, at the end of each year, will we be able to use those dollars to balance the budget to make sure that it certifies? The answer is yes, and historically always
That's what I mean. It's on paper.
Yes, on paper. That is correct.
That surplus, that cash reserve, also includes, does it not, the $4.5 billion that was for schools contingent on other things that didn't happen?
Correct. That I pointed out. Yes, ma'am.
And then also, is it inclusive of the COVID dollars that were used to the tune of about $5.5 billion to pay for operating expenses for TDCJ that we can't supplant again. Right. That was one-time federal dollars. We're going to need to pay for that this time if we want to have our prisons staffed.
Say, for example, that 18, which is now, I mentioned 20, includes y'all's appropriation in the fourth called session, which reduces the 18, but then you add the 4.5 that you mentioned back to it. And then also not part of that number, but one that is important, and I just kind of alluded to it, is that yes, y'all use, in my opinion, rightfully so, the remainder of the COVID money to utilize those.
Sure, I agree.
But because if you didn't use that in TDCJ, then the 20 would be 15. But the point being is, y'all are going to need to fund that next session.
Right,
We're obviously not going to decrease Department of Criminal Justice's budget. I'm not the policymaker, but I've been around long enough. I pretty much guess you're not going to.
So, in other words, I don't know what that final number is.
Right.
But the point is that I'm trying to make here with you.
Understand.
That, yes, indeed, on paper we have a cash balance that certifies our budget, but is not necessarily available to us to spend on a variety of things.
And that's why my point is, depending on your policy decisions, whether that is public education, property tax relief, other types, whether that ends up being electric grid stability, which leadership has talked about, another portion of dollars going there, whatever that may be, this is a big state, and a few 1-2 moves is a lot of money. Well, it may not be a lot to y'all, I know not to Richard Raymond, but it is Glenn Hager. He just showed up, so I was calling him out. That's all.
And then, of course, we know that things happen with the supplemental that are going to impact that as well in terms of typically, and I don't know what's going to happen this time because of all the folks that have been bumped off of Medicaid that we haven't gotten back on. But we typically have a couple of billion anyway
some
of Medicaid.
Typically some supplemental appropriation of some amount.
Right. And so that's going to impact also what we have available to us. I'm looking too at what you gave us. Interest and investment income, the change over the CRE was 71.1%.
Mm-hmm.
Huge.
Yes.
So that's not going to continue, is it?
I hope it is. My team's doing a good job, but I would.
Interest rates are going down.
Yeah, I would say because the tools y'all have given us and flexibility, that number is going to be higher than it has been in the past. However, with that being said, the general treasury is not going to continue to earn 5% in overnight cash because interest rates are down.
Yeah.
That is correct.
So
that portion, that is
that
correct.
Kind of a significant increase is not going to happen. It may be an increase, but not to that level.
Yes. You would be assuming, yes, our overnight deposits will be less. That is correct.
And then if I could just real quickly ask you, and I'm asking you these things because I think they are important to what this committee is supposed to be looking at, with the ESF.
Yes.
My understanding from things that y'all have said in hearings is that we are going to potentially hit the cap for our rainy day fund in this next fiscal year.
That is correct. Probably. Yes, ma'am.
And if that's the case, and I understand it could be several $100 million, that money would spill back over into GR.
That is correct.
Where we have a spending limit and may not be able to even access it. And I would assume, but I'd like to know from you, that if we don't do anything to address that we will potentially be at that cap if we don't change anything for some period of time going forward.
So it's an interesting question. 2 years ago, I asked my team to do an analysis on whether we should come over here and ask you to raise that cap as to how much could be in the ESF, because I'm a big believer that fund should continue to grow. Obviously, it's there for y'all to use in an economic downturn. It's there for you to use in one-time expenses or whatever that may be. You think infrastructure, whatever. But the point is, the resources that are going into it are the resources of not just you and me. They're the resources of future generations. So I think it should continue to grow. And so therefore, we did an analysis because we knew we were going to hit the limit. It appeared last session. Our analysis was that we're probably going to hit it, but then after that, as the budget grows, the ESF cap grows, and we may not hit it again. Well, the problem that I didn't ask the question was, now that we have better tools and we can invest more of it to earn more than just overnight cash, now the team is being successful, and because our interest income, our earnings, are helping us push that limit, if that makes sense. Because you don't know the volatility of oil and gas severance tax collections, most volatile stream of revenue that we have and any state has. But it's interesting because we've been successful. Now we are hitting that cap more often. So I think that at some point, am I coming this session? Probably not, but at some point maybe I will be coming to y'all and saying, but that's a policy decision. Do you want that money spilling back in the budget? Do you want that money to continue to grow there? That's y'all's policy decision.
And this.
But you know my opinion on that.
Thank you. This ESF formula that we have is based on 1987 oil and gas prices. And so we might need to look at it in some form or fashion, how we choose to do it. But I know that your office has also looked over the years at the possibility of creating another fund, a legacy fund, that could be used for underfunded liabilities, could be used for water infrastructure, could be used for whatever.
Yes,
and this might be an opportunity to consider using that rather than letting it just spill back over into GR and then maybe not even be able to use it because of the limit.
Depending on, and we don't know those yet.
And is it not correct that the rating agencies look at using your ESF for infrastructure investment, not just how much money you have in there, but also that you're using it to invest in the infrastructure of your state.
If you have a fund and you don't ever use it, does it give you credit? But, the fact is y'all have used it several times, so therefore Texas has been willing to utilize that. So we get credit for it, is my point.
Yeah. So there are opportunities for us here. Clearly, we're not growing at the same rate that we were.
That's right.
With our sales tax revenue.
Still growing, just modestly, more modestly.
Yeah.
Which is not all bad.
No, it's not. Definitely not. But I think it's going to be important that we get real clear, consistent information. And y'all give it to us. I'm not saying that you don't.
I understand. I know that.
It's
all the other people that you're
It's all the
getting
other
from.
people,
Yeah, I
right.
understand that.
No, I'm just hoping that we, as we're talking with our colleagues and with our constituents and trying to figure out how we want to move forward here,
Understand.
that we have a grasp of the reality of our budget, including what that so-called surplus is and how we can use our ESF so that we use good economic policy judgments moving forward. So
Yes, ma'am.
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner, and please show Representative Raymond, who will be next, as president.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Controller, I wanted to ask you about the property value study, since we're mainly talking about property taxes this afternoon. What, if you can just give a thumbnail sketch of how that works from the Controller's office. I'll probably have follow-up questions for Commissioner Rath. He's up next, but I kind of want to understand how that process works.
Yes, happy to. The short of it in state statute, my office in the property tax division is supposed to do a couple different studies. One of them is the property value study. And obviously all properties are valued as of January 1 of each year. However, with that being said, not all property transactions occur on January 1. And so therefore we are required, because of school finance, again, as we were talking earlier, pot of money that comes out of as local property taxpayers and those of us as state taxpayers. And so in other words, what is the fair and equitable values across the state of Texas, that they're all supposed to be equally valued and appraised in the different categories. And so therefore we have, through the property value study, look at half of the school districts, half of those appraisals every other year. That's just a process that we go through. We look at the different data that we have, and so therefore the whole point is that local values are not being appraised too high, nor are they appraised too low. It's trying to make sure that across the state, standards are being equitable and fair across the state of Texas. And so that is a process we go through. We work with the appraisal districts, is principally who it is, even though it's more so because of the school finance formula, but that's who we work with and check the homework on per se. But with that being said, there's an appeals process, there's a process you can go through, and typically we end up working out all the details. That's the thumbnail sketch.
Okay. And so the requirement that appraisals be fair and equitable, or that property taxation be fair and equitable?
The values.
Or is it both?
The values.
The valuation, therefore the appraisal.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that a constitutional requirement?
If I remember correctly, it is in the Constitution. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
My trustee Shannon is shaking her head yes to make sure I'm correct.
That was my understanding.
It is.
Yeah. Okay. And so you said you do the study on half of the school districts each year, so every district would have the study done every other year? Is that right?
Principally, yes.
Yeah, okay. And it's done by school district, not appraisal district?
So it's by appraisal district. However, we also look at it's the values within each school district is what it is. And then we also have another study that looks at the methods and appraisals of half of the appraisal districts, which is not this discussion, but that's why I have to say it in my mind, because we're separating out the two in my side.
Got it.
But yes, of the school districts.
Of the school districts, okay.
I had to talk out loud to get it correct.
I understand it's complex. And then the appeal process, so if your office finds that, let's say you find in your study that the appraisals are
too high, too low, whichever.
Too high or too low.
And within a category, not all categories, because they're different categories. multifamily, single family,
Okay,
commercial.
type of property.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Open space, minerals, all the different types of properties.
Okay. So single family home would be a type of.
Correct.
Okay. And so if you find that the appraisal value is locally been appraised too low or too high,
whichever,
either one, it's wrong. So then what happens?
So then, obviously, and anytime if I misspeak or you want more details, Shannon can. But essentially, we provide that information. They have their information, and then either they can accept or disagree. And if there's a disagreement, there's a conversation. But then there's also an appeal process through the SOA process. So it's internally, and it can continue to go fast forward past that. But typically, I don't know, we have about 130 to 60, maybe 70, that are kind of this kind of quasi protest process, and usually after about a year, all of them are pretty much settled, but maybe there's 2 or 3 or 10 that are not. Correct? Just
Okay.
looking for my homework over here.
I understand. And so in that process, that's the school district that is technically making the appeal?
Yes.
Okay. Even though they don't do the appraisal.
That is correct.
They're the ones
They're
holding the bag,
the ones
basically.
that have the impact.
Yes. Okay.
And has an impact to school funding, as I think you would know, and Commissioner Morath would mention at some point if you asked him, if there's a certain percent that they are outside what that appraisal should be, then therefore their funding is impacted from a state funding outside 5 or 10%.
Got it. And that's something TEA handles, I assume. Is that right?
In the settle up process.
Okay. I will follow up with him on that point.
Didn't mean to bring you into it, Morath.
No, he was going to get these questions.
I can't see him over my shoulder.
He's smiling. Don't worry about it.
Okay, good. I don't know if that's smiling out of happiness or sadness, but we'll leave that up to him.
But you alluded to the study on the appraisal districts.
Yes.
A separate statutory requirement, I assume, on your office that you do that?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so can you talk about that and how that works?
On the appraisal district.
On the appraisal district.
Yeah, so we essentially have a method and appraisals process where we look at their best practices. That's essentially what we do. We come in, we look at what are best practices, are they engaging in them and doing them, and it's kind of a simple process, really.
Okay. And are you looking to see if their values are accurate in that process?
That's more how their operating procedures and
more operating procedures.
That is correct.
Governance.
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Okay. And how often do you do those?
We do half of them every other year as well.
Same regimen.
That is correct.
Okay.
Per state law.
I understand. Do you happen to know when the Tarrant Appraisal District is next due for theirs?
I do not offhand.
Okay. I can ask someone in your office later on and get that answered. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
To recognize Representative Raymond.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Howard opened the door, so I want to just revisit this a little bit because it's
I heard that door squeaking, so I thought you were pushing it. I wasn't sure.
And by the way, I want you to know, this is the first time I don't wear a tie to a hearing because I knew you were going to be testifying and I wanted you to feel at home.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
But I still
Chairman.
have a collar, which you don't. But
it's still like summer outside. It's just hot.
It feels wonderful outside. But let me ask you this, Controller. I don't remember, and I apologize. Your first year in the House. What year was that?
That was a long time ago.
No, what year was it?
2003.
All right, so in 2003.
And you didn't have as much gray hair either.
Well, that happens. It just does. Working with my friends up here. Well, in 1995 was my first term on the Appropriations Committee in this room, and I studied that budget hard and really spent a lot more time with the Controller's Office than LBB. And so, Representative Howard, I found all these dedicated funds, at the time, it was about $2.3 billion is what they totaled. And so I said, wait a minute, we've got all this money and we're not, what's going on here? And well, we're using it for certification. Nobody talked about certification back then, not in terms of these funds.
Understand.
So I started bringing attention to it, and I got whipped by the chairman, not you, Chairman, another chairman, up here because I raised hell about it. And I said, hey, either, we stop collecting these taxes or we use them for their purpose, but not for, certifying the budget to essentially use money that we told taxpayers. We're going to pass these bills. We're going to create these new revenue streams, i.e. taxes, so that we can do a specific thing with it. They said, okay, so we passed them. And then we don't use it for those purposes. We use it for something else. And so my position then, as it is now, is if we're not going to use it for its stated purpose, then let's repeal the taxes.
Understand.
And I could never get anybody. I raised hell about it. Talmadge Heflin, who was on the committee with me, and very conservative Republican, said I was right. So then, 2003, he becomes chair of the committee, and I'm on the committee, and he still won't let me do anything about it. So finally, after you got here at some point, I think, was it in 11 or 13 that we finally started doing something about diversion. So now we gave it a name. So members, I can't believe that this started with me anyway in 1995, and we're still here. I missed this part because I got in a few minutes late. Tell me how much we still have right now dedicated funds that are not being used for their stated purpose and being used for certification.
I'll have to get you the number.
More or less.
Yeah, I don't have the number.
More than $1 billion.
Oh, yeah, of course.
$2 billion.
8.5. My memory just came to.
That's
Thanks
terrible,
to
man. That is. We still have 8.5 billion that we're using for certification.
Maybe depends on the year.
No, but members.
Last few years we haven't had to use.
Chairman, I know this is. Because I'm not on I follow the budget, but I hadn't asked that question in a while. I thought the bill that we finally did a few years ago would have moved us away from that. Because the point I made then and I will make today, this is why people lose faith in government. We tell them we're going to do something when it comes to their money, and then we do something else, and that's not right. So I would rather repeal those taxes if we're not going to use it for those purposes, because I'll tell you what, I'm pretty sure that we don't have that 8 billion surplus on those, because there's no more need for that. Whatever those funds were passed for, those taxes were passed for, there's probably still a need to fund those items, right? Whether it's state parks, we had a dedicated fund for state parks repairs, right? So, man, that's very, very it's not your fault, by the way. It's our fault. It's our fault up here. It has nothing to do with the controller. So don't even worry about it. I ain't putting it on you, man. It ain't on you. It's on us. But that is. Do we have a Republican majority or not in this House? Do we have a Republican majority? Guys, we got to do something about, let's tell Chairman Bonin, we got to do something about this. This ain't right. It is not right. Thank you for just bringing some attention to it. But, man, we got to do a better job.
Thank you.
And I like your sideburns. When you first got here, they were longer. They looked better back then. But
just because you tell me you like them, I keep them for you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Johnson.
So I have to push it. Okay, here we go. Thank you for bringing that up. I would be interested in a list of those intended purposes and balances. That was not what I pushed the button for, though. Mr. Comptroller, the CADs are saying, and I don't think anybody disagrees, that the property value study is the driving force behind rampantly increasing property values. So with that said, although I understand that the property value study may be constitutionally required, the percentage of difference is right now, I believe it's 5% higher, 5% lower, 10% is not. That is legislative. Is that correct?
That is correct as far as I recall.
Do you anticipate, and I had this conversation with one of your staff members many, many years ago, whether adjusting, if we're trying to accomplish some property tax, lower the driving force behind the property taxes rising as much as they are, do you anticipate that there would be any harm to the state if that percentage of increase was widened? So instead of 5%, 10%. I would prefer 25.
So I would say a couple things. One, as Representative Turner in asking his question, I think alluded to the point that we are looking at appraisal districts and the values because this impacts school finance. potentially. If one county, you want each county doing the same thing. I mean, that's what you want. You want uniformity across the state, and that's what the Constitution requires. And so, therefore, we're taking that snapshot view. However, those that are penalized if that job is not done, quote unquote, properly, whether we agree or disagree, okay, but just assume that the ones that are impacted are the school districts because of their formula funding. If you're outside that gap of 5 years for 2 out of 3 years, 10%. 1 year it has an impact. The commissioner and I visited last session as the legislature was working on different things, and some of the points that we have made, that instead of just having a cliff, if it's 10%, maybe it's a phase in. Because I think, I'm not speaking for the representative, but the school district didn't do the appraising. That was, I assuming, kind of was the point, and I agree with that. So I think, the legislature, if you had more of a phased in rather than just the cliff, if you're at 9.9, you're okay, as long as it's not 2 out of 3. But if you're 10 or 10.1, by God, ooh. So, have a little bit more of a bandwidth there. Now, what the number is, 5, 10, I mean, that's up to the policymakers. I left this job. I have my opinions, but it's their jobs, not mine. But the only thing I would, out of respect, and we've known each other for a long time, I would continue to push back that the driving of property values is not our study. The value is the fact that every morning when we wake up, there's 1,200 more people in Texas. And the fact is, half of those are moving here, and they're moving here for an economic opportunity. And we have a lot of them in this town, for example, that are moving from Silicon Valley, and they're willing to pay this. Whether that's fair to me and you who are already here, the point is that's what the new market is. And after COVID, those values across the entire state of Texas went like this. Normally it's in the suburban areas, but it has been across the entire state. And so therefore, we're taking a snapshot per statute in the Constitution. What we're required to do is what are the values. So, I had somebody the other day at an event said, yeah, I called your office to ask if you would come to my property protest with me. And I said, oh, you did? Well, and they said, yeah, you were unavailable. And he said, well, I just asked if you were going to be there, since you were the reason for my values increase. At least you could speak up for or against me. And he was joking, tongue in cheek. And I said, well, thank you for that, because he was like, yeah, my point is, what the hell does Glenn Hager have to do with this? But we get the blame, and that's okay. That's all right. But I would disagree that we are the blame. The fact is, what are the values across the state? We're just trying to check the math. That's all we're trying to do.
And most chief appraisers will tell you, but we have to pass a property value study.
Understand.
I know, and I've told my chief appraiser, I don't care whether you pass it or not. But quit beating up our taxpayers.
My point is, it's easier to point a finger to somebody else.
Yes,
and they point it to me, and that's fine, whatever.
So what I did here in response to my question is, you don't necessarily have a problem with that percentage being adjusted.
That's a policy decision.
Okay, then the second question is, because I hear this complaint as well, and also from the appraisal district side, what date range of the sales are you using? Because they're saying they're getting a hard January 1st, but your group is coming in and using sales 6 months into now, say, 2024, and they're not being allowed to use those sales, and it's creating an unfair situation for the appraisal districts in passing the value study.
And through this whole, as we're doing our study, as we go through the protest period, as we're talking about, all these things are looked at. But, if you take any county, whether it's a large county, Harris, Galveston, yours, or somewhere else in rural Texas, there's only so many sales. Mm-hmm. And we all know they're not all on January 1.
Right.
Usually there's none on January 1. And hardly any. So you got to at least go out a day. You got to go out 2 days. You got to go out a month. So, we try to go out within a reasonable distance as they get a glimpse of what it was on that day. If we were held only to January 1, you wouldn't have any data. So you got to come out, and obviously everybody's going to have an opinion. 3 months, but not 6 months, but not a year. Reasonable people have disagreements. And so we try to work with everyone to do what is reasonable and common sense, not just a hard, fast 2 days outside of that window, just to make a point.
So I've asked every chief appraiser who has complained about that to me to please show me in your rules where that is identified that they can't use later sales. And it would seem to me if I'm protesting my value in May and there's a sale in my neighborhood in April, I should be allowed to bring that to the table rather than it being dismissed.
That's outside of my
but I think it's
strength.
they say it's in your rules. I can't find it.
Yeah, I would have to get my staff because I got a lot of things moving, and I'm not that far in the weeds on the rules, to be honest with you.
Right, but the appraisal districts are, and the property owners are.
And
when
they're
protesting, they want to use the most current sale available,
Understand.
and they're not necessarily being allowed to because they can't pass the ratio study or the property value study if they go outside of that range. So if that could be more clearly identified, that would be a blessing for very many people.
I just don't know the exact answer, Cheryl.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Members, any other questions?
Going once, going twice, none? Okay, thank you.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you, Glenn, for being here. As always, we appreciate you and continue to do the great job that you were doing for the state of Texas. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And just for the fact, the chairman also asked me, he said, you were testifying, you don't have a tie on. I was like, yeah, it's not session. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you again. All right. The chair calls Commissioner Morath.